Breaking immigration and border news in the United States. Breaking immigration and border news in the United States. From aggressive ICE crackdowns and deadly enforcement controversies to nationwide protests and heartbreaking child detention cases, immigration has once again become one of the most explosive and emotional issues in America. Across the country, communities are watching closely as federal immigration policies reshape lives, spark protests, and influence political debate ahead of upcoming elections. Supporters argue that stricter border control is necessary to protect national security and reduce illegal crossings. Critics say these policies are creating humanitarian crises, tearing families apart, and undermining fundamental human rights. Tonight, we take a deep look at what is happening at the U.S. border, inside ICE detention centers, and on the streets of major American cities, and why immigration is now at the center of America's political and moral conversation. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, commonly known as ICE, is facing mounting criticism from human rights organizations, immigrant advocacy groups, and local officials. Multiple reports have raised serious concerns about overcrowding, poor medical care, and unsafe living conditions inside immigration detention facilities. Migrants held in these centers include asylum seekers, families, and individuals with no criminal history. According to advocacy groups, many detainees are being held for weeks or even months without proper access to medical treatment, legal representation, or transparent information about their cases. Lawyers report delays in court hearings, limited communication with families, and inadequate mental health support for vulnerable detainees. ICE officials deny systemic abuse, stating that facilities meet federal standards and that detainees receive medical care and due process. However, watchdog groups argue that oversight is weak and accountability remains limited. This growing tension has placed ICE at the center of a national debate. Should immigration enforcement prioritize deterrence and control, or humanitarian protection and reform? One of the most controversial developments in recent weeks involves a deadly shooting during a federal immigration enforcement operation. The incident, which occurred during a large-scale enforcement action, resulted in the death of a civilian and has raised urgent questions about the use of force by federal immigration agents. Witnesses and civil rights organizations have demanded full transparency, including the release of body camera footage and independent investigations. Protesters argue that immigration agents are increasingly operating like paramilitary forces inside American cities, often without sufficient oversight. Federal authorities have stated that the agents involved were responding to a perceived threat and acted according to protocol. However, critics say the incident highlights the dangers of aggressive enforcement tactics and blurred lines between immigration enforcement and traditional policing. This case has intensified calls for reform, with many Americans asking a critical question: how much power should federal immigration agents have within local communities? In response to recent enforcement actions and deadly incidents, large protests have erupted in cities, including Minneapolis, Portland, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. Demonstrators have taken to the streets demanding immigration reform, limits on ICE operations, and stronger protections for immigrant families. Protest signs read messages such as "Human rights are not illegal," "End family detention," and "Justice for immigrants." Local leaders in several cities have publicly criticized aggressive federal enforcement, arguing that it creates fear within immigrant communities and discourages cooperation with local law enforcement. Some mayors and city councils have reaffirmed their commitment to so-called sanctuary city policies, which limit local cooperation with federal immigration authorities. Supporters say these policies protect community trust, while opponents argue they undermine federal law. The protests reflect a deeper divide in American society, not just over immigration, but over identity, power, and the meaning of justice. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful story to capture national attention involves a 5-year-old child detained alongside his father during an immigration enforcement action. Images of the young child quickly spread across social media, sparking widespread outrage and emotional reactions from Americans across the political spectrum. Advocacy groups argued that detaining young children causes long-term psychological harm and violates basic principles of child welfare. After days of public pressure and legal challenges, a federal judge ordered the release of the child and his father. The decision was celebrated by activists, but also reignited debate over family detention practices. This case has become a symbol of the broader immigration debate. How should a nation enforce its laws while protecting the most vulnerable? Medical experts warn that detention environments are particularly harmful to children, citing increased risks of trauma, anxiety, and developmental issues. Immigration officials, meanwhile, argue that family detention is sometimes necessary to ensure compliance with immigration proceedings. The question remains unresolved and deeply emotional. At the US Mexico border, enforcement has intensified significantly. The federal government reports that illegal crossings have declined compared to previous years, crediting stricter policies, increased patrols, and faster deportation procedures. Border officials argue that strong enforcement deters human smuggling networks and prevents dangerous crossings that have resulted in thousands of migrant deaths over the years. However, humanitarian organizations tell a different story. They report overcrowded shelters, overwhelmed border towns, and migrants forced to wait in dangerous conditions while their cases are processed. Critics say tougher border policies do not stop migration, but instead push people toward more dangerous routes and exploitative smugglers. They argue that many migrants are fleeing violence, poverty, and political instability, forces that enforcement alone cannot solve. Immigration has now become one of the most powerful political issues ahead of upcoming U.S. elections. Conservative leaders are calling for even tougher enforcement, expanded detention capacity, and faster deportations. They argue that border security is essential for national safety, economic stability, and the rule of law. Progressive leaders, on the other hand, are pushing for comprehensive immigration reform, including pathways to legal status, protections for undocumented workers, and limits on detention and enforcement powers. Polls show that Americans remain deeply divided. While many support stronger borders, there is also broad concern about family separation, humanitarian treatment, and civil liberties. This political battle is shaping campaign speeches, advertising, and voter turnout, and could determine the future direction of U.S. immigration policy. Beyond politics and protests, the real impact of immigration policy is felt inside immigrant households across the country. Many families live in constant fear of detention or deportation, even after years of living and working in the United States. Children worry about their parents not coming home. Workers avoid reporting crimes or unsafe conditions out of fear of exposure. Community organizations report increased stress, anxiety, and depression among immigrant populations. Schools, churches, and local nonprofits are stepping in to provide legal assistance, counseling, and emergency support. At the same time, immigrant communities continue to contribute significantly to the U.S. economy, workforce, and culture, a fact often cited by reform advocates. As enforcement continues and protests grow, the United States faces a defining question. Can the nation balance border security with compassion, law enforcement with human rights, and political priorities with moral responsibility? Experts warn that without meaningful reform, the cycle of crisis, outrage, and protest will continue. Immigration is not just a policy issue, it is a human issue, touching millions of lives. The decisions made in the coming months could reshape America's immigration system for decades to come. From ICE detention centers and border enforcement to city streets filled with protesters and courtrooms deciding the fate of families, immigration remains one of the most complex and emotional challenges facing the United States today. As the debate intensifies, one thing is clear: immigration is no longer just a border issue. It is a national story about identity, justice, and the future of America. What happens next will depend not only on lawmakers and officials, but on voters, communities, and the voices demanding change.